I have performed this concerto a few times before, so it's not a new piece. Every time I come back to it, there are always new treasures to discover, and it is a remarkable piece, and I think most pianists all regard this concerto to be incredibly special among his 5 piano concerti. The precedent for the piano concerto was sort of mastered by Mozart. And what we're used to hearing is the orchestra start the piece and introduce the themes and develop them slightly. And then there's a grand entrance by the soloist, and they repeat the same themes and elaborate on them. So Beethoven wanted to do something different. And so the first sounds that the audience hears are not by the orchestra at all, but by the piano. The piano actually starts the piece, and not in a grand manner either. It's a very gentle sort of murmuring of these repeated notes, which coincidentally mimic the rhythm of the opening of his famous Fifth Symphony, which he was writing at the same time. So there's this very gentle, tender, contemplative opening by the piano. And then after 5 bars, the piano just withdraws and disappears for the next 70 bars. But what's really, really remarkable to me, aside from this sort of untraditional opening, is that the way the orchestra responds to that opening piano entrance is incredibly magical, because the orchestra, the first thing we hear from them is them coming in an entirely different key of B major. The piece is in G major, and the first thing we hear from the orchestra is a B major triad. And they immediately, by the 6th bar of the piece, we're in a completely foreign key and a very magical place. And I think Beethoven doing this produces a moment of poetry that echoes in the audience's mind throughout the rest of the movement. He revisits this little trick of harmony later in the piece, and the piano elaborates that time. So that's one of the most remarkable things about this piece. I mean, in general, this concerto, compared to the others, has a character of intimacy and lyricism and serenity, compared to the 3rd and 5th concerto, for example, that surround it, that are both much grander and forceful, more aggressive. So this shows Beethoven's more serene side. I mean, another thing that's amazing to me is this piece was written around the same time as some of his greatest works. I mean, if you just look at the opus number of this work, it's 58. And the works that he was writing at the same time, and he was working on his opera Fidelio, and he wrote some of his most famous piano sonatas, the Waldstein and the Appassionata, his triple concerto, the Razumovsky string quartets. And as I mentioned earlier, he was already working on his 5th symphony. Not to mention his beautiful violin concerto. So this was an unbelievably creative period happening when he wrote this piece. The Appassionata Sonata is opus 57, and the reason I bring that up is the Appassionata might be the angriest piece of music I've ever heard come from his pen. It's unbelievably passionate but angry, and I think he's dealing with his deafness and how it's just completely ironic and tragic that a composer should lose his hearing. And so I think between that display of anger in the Appassionata and then you take this other sort of yin and yang, and you look at this concerto, which explores the absolute opposite side of that anger, but sort of a quiet acceptance or, feeling resolved to the situation. It's just amazing to pair these two pieces written at the same time. So a lot of people find this piece remarkable because of the second movement, which is, again, amazing in many different ways. One, it's very brief. It's just over 5 minutes in length. And it sounds like, not sounds, but it really is a dramatic dialogue between the protagonist, being the pianist, and the orchestra, which there are different theories about what's happening musically here. There was a biographer of Beethoven a few decades after Beethoven passed away, and that biographer suggested that this movement bore a resemblance to Gluck's opera Orfeo and Eurydice, specifically to Orpheus's trying to enter the netherworld, or Hades. And he was using his music, he's playing a lyre, to tame the beasts of the underworld, and pleading with them to be allowed passage to reunite with Eurydice, who had died. The validity of that theory is that this opera was very popular in Vienna during Beethoven's time, and everybody knew this story, and it was very possible that it crept into Beethoven's subconscious or not. And in this movement, the piano's lyricism does prevail in the end. It's really, really beautiful. This is extraordinary though, because we don't normally associate Beethoven as being a programmatic composer, with very little exception. Some people say his Sixth Symphony, the Pastoral, is programmatic. What I think more about, as I already mentioned, he's dealing with his deafness. There's an effect with the piano and orchestra in this movement, the pianist is sort of standing aloof from the orchestra. And to me, it recalls the desolation expressed by Beethoven upon realizing his own isolation and increasing deafness. He had written a letter to his brothers just a couple years earlier, which became known as the Heiligenstadt Testament. One would almost associate this letter as being like a suicide note, just an absolute grief over what's happening to him. There was one quote borrowed from that he mentions. He says to his brothers, "Forgive me then if you see me shrink away all alone, because I must live like an exile." The third movement, there's not much to say. By contrast, it's much lighter and just a charming work. Beethoven plays tricks on the listener again in this movement. And the second movement is in E minor, so the last notes we hear are that sonority. And Beethoven uses that E as a common tone modulation to start the third movement in the key of C major, which is the wrong key again, because the piece is in G major. But he quickly resolves this theme to G major. So throughout this charming last movement, rondo movement, he's playing with the listener's expectations of where the music's going to go and sort of playing tricks on the listener. So it's a beautifully balanced work. And again, as I said, very, very special for pianists. I think they all regard this with a kind of dignity and respect. Most famously, perhaps, by Martha Argerich, who apparently refuses to perform this piece in public. I think she may have recorded it, but for her, it's such holy ground. She doesn't want to somehow ruin the music by performing it. It's very interesting. With today's ears, this music might not sound so revolutionary anymore. We don't even pick up on these revolutionary ideas of starting a concerto with the soloist and not with the orchestra, for example. I think we take it for granted. And when I teach students and when I go back to pieces I've learned before, I like to look at it with the eyes of somebody who heard it for the first time, perhaps, and not take any of this music and these magical moments for granted, that they're just as magical now as they were 250 years ago. It's really a pleasure and honor to play it. Making a life in classical music, and in a way I feel like I'm an art historian of some sorts, because I tend to spend my waking hours thinking about the past. I play a lot of music from the 19th century because it was sort of the greatest writing for the instrument that I play, the piano. So many pianists often stay in this century because one can't possibly explore in their lifetime. As I said, I spent a lot of time thinking about this music, thinking about the composers lived in, what they were facing in their own lives, and in many ways humanizing them. I remember when I went to Vienna for the first time, I was completely blown away by these massive statues in the middle of their Stadtpark, their Central Park, where they're just idolizing their treasures. And first of all, I'm like, wow, what a concept that we treasure our past like this. And I would just sit in front of these statues for hours and write in my journal and just take in the moment, which is great. And I still do idolize these composers as being unsurpassed, really, in terms of their creativity and their genius. But at the same time, as I've spent more time with these composers and their pieces, I've tried to see what I can to understand them more as human beings, with their faults and their idiosyncrasies, and that they were people like you and me, and they had their issues, And in many cases, what amazes me is that despite their personal problems, whether it was disease or financial problems, that they were able to isolate their creative efforts and still, write music that sort of adored something bigger than themselves. Beethoven just grappling with his loss of hearing and just what this would do to him emotionally and psychologically in every manner. It's absolutely tragic. And to me, it's just so beautiful to hear musically how he deals with it and how he reaches inwardly, especially in this piece, to deal with something very human, very visceral, and something that I think all of us today can relate to, because many of us deal with disease, or at some point all of us do, deal with loss. And I think there's something incredibly human about this music that even a novice to classical music will be able to connect to on an emotional level. It's an unbelievably ideal example of somebody who reveres art above their own suffering and reminds us that we all need a creative outlet. I think whether it be drawing or painting or singing or whatever it is, sculpting, we all need that. We all need to find that, I think, and be able to emote that way. I think it centers us and keeps us grounded, and also helps us to think about more positive things than our own ailments. My understanding of Beethoven was that he probably did not open up well personally. I mean, I don't want to misspeak about what kind of conditions he might have been suffering himself, but he he might have had anger management issues, for example, and he upset many of his patrons, and he was an irascible sort of fellow and was not well loved on a personal level, but his music just transcends all of that. And I think people even then were forgiving of his personality flaws because his music was cathartic. So I do believe that music was catharsis for him, and it helped him to live as long as he did, given the difficult conditions he faced in his life. Well, the Grizzly experience for me has been quite amazing, because when I'm in their environment and see the kind of art that's lurking within them. I mean, these presentations, the slideshows, and seeing what they've painted while they've listened to Ravel's Pavane, for example, has just been mind blowing to me. And it proves to me that even in the most unexpected people, there's great expression and emotion and creativity within all of them. And sometimes it just needs to be tapped. Doing these events at the Grizzly Academy have been just as moving for me, if not more, to witness what kind of outlet, what kind of expression that these kids have that might not have been tapped prior to this project that Orchestra Novo has been encouraging and working with them. I think Orchestra Novo is doing an amazing community service by meeting and working with these kids